March 4th, 1933. The United States of America is on the verge of total collapse. Banks are shuttered. A quarter of the workforce is unemployed. Millions are homeless. Hope is a forgotten luxury. On this grim day, a new president, a man crippled by polio, stands before a terrified nation and speaks 4 immortal lines. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself. With that single declaration, Franklin D. Roosevelt began one of the most transformative, consequential, and controversial presidencies in history. This is the story of the man who waged war on the Great Depression, who became a beacon of hope for millions and a dangerous radical to others, and whose actions would not only save America, but redefine the role of government forever. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was born on January 30th, 1882, in Hyde Park, New York. He was the only child of James Roosevelt and Sarah Delano Roosevelt, who were distant cousins and both came from wealthy, established New York families with Dutch origins. His father, James, was a Harvard graduate and a successful businessman involved in coal and transportation industries, including railroads and shipping companies. His mother, Sarah, was well-traveled with liberal views, but also extremely protective, playing the primary role in raising Franklin during his early years, often intervening deeply in his life, even as he grew older. The Roosevelt family lived in a spacious estate called Springwood in Hyde Park, where Franklin grew up in an affluent environment surrounded by farms, gardens, and outdoor activities. In 1887, at the age of 5, Franklin had the opportunity to meet President Grover Cleveland at the White House. Cleveland, in a moment of humor that carried prophetic irony, wished Franklin that he would never become president, a story Franklin later recounted as an amusing twist of fate. From a young age, Franklin received his education at home through private tutors, a common practice among upper-class families at the time, rather than attending public schools. He was homeschooled until the age of 14, during which he proved to be a capable student, particularly excelling in languages. Annual family trips to Europe helped him become fluent in German and French, while exposing him to diverse cultures, from museums in Paris to resorts in Germany. Beyond academics, Franklin was passionate about sports, engaging in activities such as lawn tennis, polo, horseback riding, and learning to shoot rifles. These pursuits not only developed his physical abilities, but also shaped his energetic and adventurous personality. He also began collecting stamps at the age of 8, a hobby he maintained throughout his life, viewing it as a way to relax and organize his thoughts, especially later when facing illness. These early years at home laid the foundation for his confidence and broad knowledge, though they also resulted in a somewhat isolated childhood with limited interactions with peers. At the age of 14 in 1896, Franklin enrolled in Groton Episcopal School, a prestigious boarding school in Massachusetts for the children of the elite. This marked a significant transition from home education to a formal school environment. At Groton, he continued participating in sports, playing on teams and other activities, while also joining the debate team and choir, which honed his public speaking and teamwork skills. The headmaster, Endicott Peabody, had a profound influence on Franklin, emphasizing Christian values such as charity and public service, encouraging students to use their privileges to help others rather than pursue only personal gain. Peabody's philosophy that those with advantages must apply them for societal benefit later informed Franklin's political career. His time at Groton not only strengthened his academic knowledge but also built his character, helping him overcome his mother's overprotectiveness and develop independence. He graduated from Groton in 1900, prepared to enter the next phase of higher education. After graduating from Groton, Franklin entered Harvard University in 1900. There, he became more socially active, joining various clubs, including prestigious ones like the Porcellian Club, though he was rejected from some others due to social reasons. He served as editor-in-chief of the Harvard Crimson newspaper, where he sharpened his writing and leadership skills, often covering campus and societal issues. Although he later criticized his economics courses at Harvard for teaching him flawed theories, particularly classical economics, the experience built his self-assurance and social network, making him popular among students. The year 1900 also brought a major loss when his father James passed away, leaving a secure financial legacy, but causing his mother Sarah to become even more attached to her son. In 1901, the assassination of President William McKinley elevated his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt to the presidency, igniting Franklin's interest in. Admired for his dynamic and reformist leadership style, Franklin completed his Harvard degree in just 3 years, graduating in 1903 with a Bachelor of Arts in History, demonstrating his quick and efficient learning abilities. Following Harvard, Franklin pursued law studies at Columbia University in New York, starting in 1903. He did not complete the degree but studied sufficiently to pass the New York bar exam in 1907, after which he left without graduating. During this period, he focused more on practical subjects than theory and frequently expressed his ambition to become president, drawing inspiration from his cousin Theodore. Upon passing the bar, he began practicing at a prominent New York City law firm, handling cases related to business and finance, though he was not particularly passionate about the work. This real-world experience deepened his understanding of the business and legal worlds, preparing him for his future political endeavors, but he viewed it as a temporary stepping stone. In 1902, while at Harvard, Franklin met and began courting Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the niece of President Theodore Roosevelt and his fifth cousin once removed. Their relationship faced strong opposition from his mother Sarah, who feared losing control over her son. Nevertheless, they married on March 17, 1905, with President Theodore Roosevelt personally giving the bride away, turning the event into a major social occasion. The couple had 6 children, but only 5 survived infancy. Anna, born 1906, James, 1907, Elliot, 1910, Franklin Jr., 1914, and John, 1916, with another son passing away in infancy in 1909. Eleanor later admitted that early married life was challenging for her, and she was not a natural mother, often feeling overwhelmed by family responsibilities and interference from her mother-in-law, Sarah. Franklin, amidst his work and interests, continued his stamp collecting as a form of relaxation, particularly under pressure. This period established family stability, but also revealed underlying tensions that would later impact their relationship, especially after Franklin's illness. Franklin Delano Roosevelt made his entry into politics in 1910 at the age of 28, when he decided to run for a seat in the New York State Senate as a Democrat. This was a bold move as he was contesting in the 26th District, which encompassed Dutchess, Columbia, and Putnam counties, and had been a reliably Republican stronghold for over 3 decades. Roosevelt's campaign was innovative for its time, relying heavily on grassroots efforts rather than traditional party machinery. He traveled extensively throughout the rural district in a red Maxwell automobile, a novelty that drew crowds and allowed him to connect directly with voters. He emphasized progressive reforms, such as improving rural roads, supporting farmers, and advocating for conservation policies, inspired by his cousin Theodore Roosevelt's legacy. Despite the district's Republican leanings, Roosevelt's charisma, family name, and energetic campaigning led to an upset victory in the November election, where he won by a margin of about 1,000 140 votes out of over 15,000 cast. This win marked the beginning of his political ascent and demonstrated his ability to appeal across party lines. Upon taking office in January 1911, Roosevelt quickly established himself as a reform-minded insurgent within the Democratic Party. He aligned with a group of progressive Democrats who sought to challenge the dominance of Tammany Hall, the powerful and notoriously corrupt political machine controlled by Charles F. Murphy in New York City. Tammany Hall exerted significant influence over Democratic nominations and legislation, often through patronage and backroom deals. Roosevelt's most notable stand came during the contentious selection of a U.S. Senator from New York, a process then handled by the state legislature. He led a faction of about 20 insurgent Democrats who refused to support William F. Sheehan, Tammany's preferred candidate, whom they viewed as too tied to corporate interests. This rebellion lasted for over 2 months, involving heated debates and negotiations, and ultimately forced Sheehan's withdrawal, leading to the election of James A. O'Gorman as a compromise. Roosevelt's actions earned him enemies within the party, but also a reputation as a principled reformer committed to clean government. During this period, he also began building alliances with other progressives and introduced bills on issues like forest preservation and labor rights, reflecting his growing interest in social welfare. In the midst of his insurgent activities, Roosevelt threw his support behind Woodrow Wilson, the progressive governor of New Jersey, for the Democratic presidential nomination in 1911. This decision was significant because it pitted him against his Republican cousin, Theodore Roosevelt, who was mounting a comeback bid as an independent progressive candidate after breaking with the Republican Party. Franklin admired Theodore, but believed Wilson's platform of tariff reform, antitrust measures, and banking regulation better aligned with Democratic principles. His endorsement helped Wilson secure key delegates from New York at the 1912 Democratic National Convention. Later that year, Roosevelt faced his own re-election challenge in the state Senate. However, he contracted typhoid fever in the fall of 1912, which left him bedridden and unable to campaign actively. His wife, Eleanor, and close friend Lewis Howe stepped in to manage the campaign, organizing rallies and distributing literature. Despite his illness and the district's Republican history, Roosevelt won re-election by a slim margin, bolstered by the national Democratic wave that swept Wilson into the presidency. This victory solidified his position and highlighted the emerging role of Eleanor in his political life. As a reward for his loyalty and support during the 1912 campaign, President Woodrow Wilson appointed Roosevelt as Assistant Secretary of the Navy in March 1913, a position previously held by his cousin Theodore under President William McKinley. At 31 years old, Roosevelt was eager to take on the role, viewing it as an opportunity to modernize the Navy and prepare for potential international conflicts. Working under Secretary Josephus Daniels, a more conservative figure, Roosevelt handled much of the day-to-day administration, including personnel matters, procurement, and labor relations. He advocated vigorously for naval expansion, pushing for increased funding to build more battleships, submarines, and destroyers amid growing tensions in Europe. His enthusiasm sometimes led to clashes with Daniels, as Roosevelt favored a more aggressive approach to preparedness. This role allowed him to travel extensively, inspecting naval yards and bases across the country, and it honed his skills in bureaucracy and crisis management, skills that would later prove essential during economic and wartime challenges. Throughout his tenure as Assistant Secretary, Roosevelt focused on strengthening the U.S. Navy's capabilities. He played a key part in establishing the Naval Reserve in 1915, which trained civilian sailors for potential mobilization, and he oversaw the rapid increase in shipbuilding programs as World War I erupted in Europe in 1914. Roosevelt's advocacy for a big navy aligned with Wilson's initial neutrality, but shifted toward preparedness as German submarine warfare escalated. He gained hands-on experience in labor issues by mediating disputes between shipyard workers and management, promoting fair wages and working conditions to ensure efficient production. These efforts exposed him to the complexities of industrial relations and union negotiations, foreshadowing his later New Deal policies. Additionally, Roosevelt's position introduced him to influential military leaders and politicians, expanding his national network and deepening his understanding of federal administration. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, Roosevelt's role became even more critical. He oversaw the massive expansion of the Navy, coordinating the deployment of ships to protect Allied convoys from German U-boats and supporting troop transports across the Atlantic. In 1918, he traveled to Europe on an inspection tour, visiting naval facilities in England and France, and even venturing to the front lines in Belgium and France. There, he witnessed the devastation of trench warfare firsthand, including bombed-out villages and the human toll of battle, which he later described as exposing him to the horrors of the war. This experience profoundly shaped his views on internationalism and the need for global cooperation to prevent future conflicts. During the tour, he contracted influenza during the 1918 pandemic, which weakened him temporarily, but did not deter his duties. His wartime service enhanced his reputation as a capable administrator and patriot, though he resigned briefly in 1918 to seek a naval commission for active duty, only to be persuaded by Wilson to remain in his post. Following the armistice in November 1918, Roosevelt continued in his role through the Paris Peace Conference period, advocating for the inclusion of naval disarmament discussions. He resigned as Assistant Secretary in August 1920 after 7 years, having transformed the position into one of significant influence. His tenure provided invaluable experience in executive leadership, wartime logistics, and foreign affairs, setting the stage for his future roles. By this time, he had also begun to position himself for higher office, leveraging his visibility from the Navy Department. In July 1920, at the Democratic National Convention in San Francisco, Roosevelt was nominated as the vice presidential candidate on the ticket with Ohio Governor James M. Cox. The nomination came after a protracted convention where Cox emerged as the compromise presidential choice. Roosevelt, at 38, was selected for his youth, energy, and national name recognition, as well as to balance the ticket geographically and ideologically. The platform defended Wilson's progressive legacy, particularly emphasizing U.S. entry into the League of Nations as a means to ensure lasting peace. However, the post-war mood in America favored isolationism and a return to normalcy, making these positions unpopular amid economic readjustment and social unrest. The Cox-Roosevelt ticket launched an energetic campaign, with Roosevelt crisscrossing the country by train, delivering over 1,000 speeches in 35 states. He focused on appealing to young voters, farmers, and progressives, attacking Republican opponents, Warren G. Harding and Calvin Coolidge, for their vagueness and ties to big business. Roosevelt's oratory skills shone, and he used innovative tactics like radio broadcasts and newsreels to reach wider audiences. Despite their efforts, the Democrats faced headwinds from war fatigue, scandals in the Wilson administration, and a desire for change. On Election Day in November 1920, the ticket suffered a landslide defeat, winning only 34% of the popular vote and carrying just 11 states in the South. Harding and Coolidge secured a decisive victory with over 60% of the vote. Although the loss was crushing, the 1920 campaign provided Roosevelt with invaluable national exposure. He emerged as a prominent figure in the Democratic Party, known for his optimism, resilience, and ability to connect with diverse audiences. The experience broadened his political horizons, teaching him about national issues and campaign strategies. In the months following the election, Roosevelt returned to private life, resuming law practice and business ventures in New York. But the campaign had firmly established him as a rising star, even as he faced personal health challenges in 1921 that would soon alter his path. Forged in fire. In August 1921, while on a family vacation at their summer home on Campobello Island in New Brunswick, Canada, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then 39 years old, suddenly fell ill after a day of strenuous activities that included swimming in the cold Bay of Fundy waters, sailing, and fighting a small forest fire. He experienced severe chills, fever, and muscle weakness, which rapidly progressed to paralysis in his legs and lower body. Initially misdiagnosed by local doctors as a cold or fatigue, his condition worsened, leaving him unable to stand or walk without assistance. By mid-August, specialists from Boston confirmed the diagnosis as poliomyelitis, commonly known as polio, a viral infection that attacks the nervous system and can cause permanent paralysis. However, in later years, retrospective medical analyses by experts suggested it might have been Guillain-Barré syndrome, an autoimmune disorder that mimics polio symptoms but often allows for partial recovery based on the rapid onset symmetrical paralysis and lack of typical polio fever patterns. The illness struck at the height of his rising political career, following his vice presidential run, and confined him to bed for weeks. His mother, Sarah, who had always been overprotective, urged him to retire to a quiet life at the family estate in Hyde Park, viewing politics as too demanding for his new condition. However, with strong encouragement from his wife Eleanor, who had grown more independent during his absences, and his loyal political advisor Lewis Howe, who believed in his potential, Roosevelt resolved to fight back and continue pursuing his ambitions. This support network became crucial as Howe moved into the Roosevelt home to help manage his recovery and political image, while Eleanor began handling more public duties on his behalf. Beginning in late 1921 and continuing through the 1920s, Roosevelt embarked on an intensive rehabilitation regimen to regain as much mobility as possible, despite the permanence of his paralysis from the waist down. He spent months at various medical facilities, including time in New York hospitals, where he underwent experimental treatments like electrical stimulation and hydrotherapy. By 1922, he had taught himself to walk short distances using heavy steel leg braces that weighed about 10 pounds each, locked at the knees, along with crutches or a cane for balance, and often relying on the arm of a strong aide or family member to steady him. This method required immense upper body strength, which he built through rigorous exercises, including swimming and weightlifting. Determined to project an image of vitality and leadership, Roosevelt made extraordinary efforts to conceal his disability from the public eye. He avoided being photographed or seen in his wheelchair, which he used privately, and orchestrated appearances where he would be propped up behind podiums or in cars. The press, largely cooperative due to the era's norms of privacy for public figures, rarely mentioned his condition, helping maintain the illusion of full recovery. This period tested his resilience as he faced not only physical pain, but also emotional challenges, including depression, yet it forged his character, emphasizing empathy for the suffering of others that would later influence his policies. In 1924, seeking warmer waters believed to aid polio recovery, Roosevelt discovered the natural mineral springs at a rundown resort in Warm Springs, Georgia, where the buoyant 88-degree water allowed him to move his legs more freely without braces. Impressed by the therapeutic effects, he purchased the property in 1926 for $195,000, using much of his personal inheritance, and transformed it into a dedicated hydrotherapy rehabilitation center for polio patients. Throughout the late 1920s, he spent extended periods there, sometimes up to several months a year, undergoing treatments, socializing with fellow patients, and fostering a sense of community that he called the Warm Springs family. This not only provided personal solace and minor improvements in his muscle tone, but also shifted his perspective toward public health initiatives. His experiences led him to establish the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation in 1927 to fund operations and make treatments accessible to those who couldn't afford them. Later, in 1938, building on this foundation, he founded the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis, which raised millions through public campaigns and played a pivotal role in funding research that culminated in the development of the Salk and Sabin polio vaccines in the 1950s, effectively eradicating the disease in the United States. Despite his health setbacks, Roosevelt remained actively connected to the Democratic Party from 1921 onward, strategically positioning himself for a comeback. He corresponded extensively with party leaders, offered advice on campaigns, and used his time in recovery to study policy issues deeply. His first major public reappearance came at the 1924 Democratic National Convention in New York, where he delivered a stirring nominating speech for New York Governor Al Smith, whom he dubbed the Happy Warrior. Standing with braces and gripping the podium for support, the speech was a triumph, showcasing his oratorical skills and dispelling doubts about his capabilities. He repeated this role at the 1928 convention in Houston, again nominating Smith, who secured the presidential nomination that year. These appearances served as deliberate dress rehearsals for his own return to the political stage, allowing him to test public reactions to his physical presence and rebuild his confidence in speaking while supported. In 1928, as Al Smith pursued the presidency, he persuaded Roosevelt to run for governor of New York to strengthen the Democratic ticket in the state, despite Roosevelt's initial reluctance due to his health and desire for more recovery time at Warm Springs. Campaigning vigorously from trains and automobiles to minimize walking, Roosevelt highlighted his progressive credentials and family legacy, winning the election by a narrow margin of about 25,000 votes out of over 4 million cast, even as Smith lost the national race to Herbert Hoover. As governor starting in January 1929, Roosevelt implemented innovative programs, including the development of hydroelectric power plants along the St. Lawrence River to provide affordable electricity and create jobs. He also tackled the persistent farm crisis by advocating for tax relief for farmers and promoting agricultural cooperatives. To connect directly with constituents, he pioneered the use of radio broadcasts, holding informal fireside chats, where he explained policies in simple, reassuring terms, a technique that built public trust and would become a hallmark of his presidency. The Wall Street crash of October 1929 plunged the nation into the Great Depression, with unemployment soaring and banks failing, exacerbating the economic woes that began under Hoover. As governor, Roosevelt responded proactively in 1930 by establishing the first state-level unemployment relief commission in the country, which studied joblessness and recommended aid programs. He publicly endorsed unemployment insurance, a radical idea at the time, arguing that the government had a duty to protect citizens from economic hardship. His re-election in November 1930 was a landslide, with a margin of over 725,000 votes, reflecting public approval of his activist approach amid national despair. In 1931, he pushed through a comprehensive economic relief package, allocating $20 million for emergency aid, and created the Temporary Emergency Relief Administration, which provided direct assistance to the unemployed through work projects and food distribution, serving as a model for federal New Deal programs. Additionally, Roosevelt launched investigative commissions to root out corruption in public offices, targeting figures like New York City Mayor Jimmy Walker, and weakening the influence of Tammany Hall, the Democratic machine he had opposed earlier in his career. By 1932, Roosevelt's successful handling of the Depression in New York positioned him as the frontrunner for the Democratic presidential nomination. He assembled a team of academic advisors known as the Brains Trust, including professors like Raymond Moley, Rexford Tugwell, and Adolph Burley, who helped craft innovative policy ideas. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago in June 1932, after intense balloting and backroom deals to overcome challenges from Al Smith and others, Roosevelt secured the nomination on the fourth ballot. Breaking with tradition, he flew from Albany to Chicago, a daring feat in the era of unreliable aviation, to accept the nomination in person, projecting an image of energy and modernity despite his disability. In his acceptance speech, he famously pledged a new deal for the American people, outlining bold government interventions such as public works projects, agricultural relief, regulation of banks and utilities, and the repeal of prohibition to stimulate the economy and restore hope. Campaigning nationwide with optimism and vigor, often using trains to address crowds from the rear platform, Roosevelt attacked Hoover's inaction and promised immediate action. On Election Day in November 1932, he achieved a landslide victory, capturing 57% of the popular vote and 472 electoral votes to Hoover's 59, while Democrats gained control of both houses of Congress. This triumph marked a profound political realignment, forging the New Deal coalition of urban workers, farmers, minorities, and intellectuals that would dominate American politics for decades. In February 1933, just weeks before his March 4th inauguration, Roosevelt narrowly escaped an assassination attempt during a speech in Miami's Bayfront Park. The assailant, Giuseppe Zangara, an Italian immigrant and anarchist motivated by personal grievances amid the Depression, fired 5 shots from a revolver, missing Roosevelt, but fatally wounding Chicago Mayor Anton Chermak, who was standing nearby, along with injuring 4 others. Zangara was quickly subdued, tried, and executed within weeks. Roosevelt remained calm during the chaos, directing aides to aid the victims and continuing his schedule, which further enhanced his image of unflappable leadership as the nation awaited his presidency. The first New Deal. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated as the 32nd President of the United States on March 4, 1933, amid the most severe depths of the Great Depression, which had gripped the nation since the 1929 stock market crash. At that time, unemployment had soared to approximately 25%, affecting over 15 million Americans, while millions more were homeless, living in makeshift shanty towns known as Hoovervilles, in derision of the outgoing president. Banks across the country were failing or closed, with runs on deposits causing widespread panic and eroding public confidence in the financial system. In his inaugural address, delivered before a crowd of over 100,000 at the Capitol and broadcast nationwide on radio, Roosevelt sought to inspire hope and action, famously declaring, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance." He outlined a vision of bold government intervention to combat the crisis, emphasizing unity and resilience. Immediately after taking office, Roosevelt's first decisive action was to declare a 4-day national bank holiday starting March 6th, temporarily closing all banks to prevent further panic withdrawals and allow for inspections. He called Congress into an emergency special session on March 9th, where, in just hours, lawmakers passed the Emergency Banking Relief Act. This legislation empowered the Federal Reserve to issue additional currency backed by bank assets, authorized the Treasury to inspect and reopen sound banks, and provided mechanisms to liquidate insolvent ones. To reassure the public, Roosevelt delivered his first fireside chat on March 12th via radio, explaining the banking measures in simple conversational terms to an audience of about 60 million. This broadcast was a resounding success, restoring faith in the system. When banks began reopening on March 13th, depositors returned over $1 billion in the first week alone, stabilizing the financial sector and marking the beginning of his 100 days of intense legislative activity. The New Deal, initiated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt upon taking office in March 1933, amid the depths of the Great Depression, represented a fundamental shift in the role of the federal government from a hands-off, laissez-faire stance to one of active intervention in economic and social affairs. This series of programs enacted during his first 2 terms, from 1933 to 1940, was structured around 3 core objectives: relief, to provide immediate aid to the suffering; recovery, to stimulate economic growth; and reform, to prevent future crises through structural changes. The first New Deal phase, spanning 1933 to 1934, emphasized urgent relief and recovery measures passed in the historic 100 days of legislative activity, where Congress approved 15 major bills to address unemployment, banking failures, and agricultural distress. Following the banking crisis, Roosevelt swiftly implemented the initial phase of his New Deal programs from March to June 1933, often referred to as the First New Deal, which aimed at immediate relief for the suffering, economic recovery to stimulate growth, and long-term reforms to prevent future collapses. This period saw the passage of 15 major bills in 100 days, an unprecedented burst of federal action. Among the key initiatives was the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, established in May 1933 under Harry Hopkins, which distributed $500 million in grants to state and local governments for direct aid and public works, helping to feed and employ millions while shifting relief from private charities to federal responsibility. In the realm of economic relief during the early New Deal, programs were designed to offer direct assistance and employment to millions affected by the Depression's widespread unemployment, which peaked at 25%, and homelessness, with shantytowns sprouting across cities. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, established in May 1933 and directed by Harry Hopkins, allocated over $3 billion in grants to states for food, clothing, and work relief projects, shifting the burden of aid from overwhelmed local charities to federal oversight and helping sustain families through soup kitchens and temporary jobs. Complementing this, the Public Works Administration, created in June 1933 under Harold Ikes, invested $3.3 billion in large-scale infrastructure projects such as dams, bridges, schools, and highways, employing up to 250,000 workers at its height, and constructing enduring assets like the Hoover Dam and thousands of public buildings that modernize the nation's physical landscape. The Public Works Administration, created in June 1933 and led by Harold Ickes, allocated over $3.3 billion for large-scale infrastructure projects, employing up to 250,000 workers at its peak in constructing roads, bridges, dams, airports, schools, and hospitals. Projects that formed the backbone of modern American infrastructure, such as the Triborough Bridge in New York and the Lincoln Tunnel. The Civilian Conservation Corps, launched in April 1933, recruited 250,000 unemployed young men aged 18 to 25 for 6-month stints in rural camps, where they planted over 3 billion trees, built parks, fought soil erosion, and developed recreational areas like Shenandoah National Park, becoming one of the most beloved New Deal agencies for its environmental impact and character-building effects. Another key initiative, the Civilian Conservation Corps, launched in April 1933, targeted young unemployed men aged 18 to 25, enlisting over 3 million participants in rural camps to perform conservation work, including reforestation, soil erosion control, and national park development, providing them with wages, education, and vocational training while combating environmental degradation from the Dust Bowl era. For economic recovery in the initial New Deal years, efforts focused on stabilizing key sectors like agriculture and industry to raise prices, boost production, and restore confidence. The Agricultural Adjustment Administration, set up in May 1933, addressed farm overproduction and falling commodity prices by subsidizing farmers to reduce crop acreage and livestock herds, paying out over $1 billion in its first years, and increasing farm income by 50% by 1936. Though it faced criticism for destroying surplus food amid widespread hunger and was partially invalidated by the Supreme Court in 1936, leading to a revised version in 1938. Similarly, the National Industrial Recovery Act, passed in June 1933, sought to revive industry through codes of fair competition that set minimum wages, maximum hours, and production quotas, while guaranteeing workers' right to unionize. Administered by the National Recovery Administration under Hugh Johnson, it aimed to eliminate cutthroat competition, but was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1935 for overstepping federal authority, prompting a pivot to more targeted reforms. In agriculture, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, set up in May 1933, addressed farm overproduction by paying subsidies to farmers to reduce acreage and slaughter surplus livestock, aiming to raise commodity prices. Though controversial for destroying crops amid hunger, it increased farm income by 50% by 1936. Financial reforms included the Glass-Steagall Act of June 1933, which separated commercial and investment banking to curb speculation and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation to insure individual bank deposits up to $2,500, a figure that was raised to $5,000 the following year, protecting savers and preventing future runs. Additionally, Roosevelt signed the Cullen-Harrison Act in March 1933, legalizing low-alcohol beer and wine, effectively signaling the end of Prohibition ahead of its full repeal later that year with the 21st Amendment. The Second New Deal and its challenges. Building on the momentum of the First New Deal, Roosevelt introduced a second wave of programs in 1935 to 1936, known as the Second New Deal, which shifted emphasis toward more structural economic reforms, social welfare, and labor rights, responding to criticisms that earlier efforts favored big business and did not go far enough for workers and the poor. This phase was influenced by growing pressure from leftist figures like Senator Huey Long and Father Charles Coughlin, who advocated for wealth redistribution. A cornerstone was the Social Security Act, signed in August 1935 after intense congressional debate, which created a federal old age pension system funded by payroll taxes, unemployment insurance administered by states, and aid for dependent children, the blind and disabled, marking the first national social safety net and providing economic security to millions, though initially excluding many agricultural and domestic workers. The reform component of the New Deal, gaining prominence in the Second New Deal from 1935 to 1936, introduced lasting institutional changes to regulate finance, protect workers, and establish social safety nets, building on earlier efforts and responding to ongoing economic challenges and political pressures from figures like Huey Long. The Glass-Steagall Act of June 1933 separated commercial and investment banking to prevent speculative excesses that contributed to the 1929 crash and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, insuring bank deposits up to $5,000 and restoring public trust, with over 99% of banks remaining stable thereafter. In 1934, the Securities and Exchange Commission was established to oversee stock markets, requiring transparency in corporate disclosures and curbing fraudulent practices, with Joseph P. Kennedy as its first chairman, ironically drawing on his insider knowledge to enforce regulations. The Works Progress Administration, established in May 1935 under Harry Hopkins, became the largest New Deal agency, employing nearly 8.5 million people over its lifespan at a cost of $11 billion, funding not only construction of 650,000 miles of roads, 125,000 public buildings, and 8,000 parks, but also arts programs, like the Federal Art Project, which supported artists, writers, and musicians, producing murals, plays, and guidebooks that enriched American culture. Labor reforms were advanced through the National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, of July 1935, which guaranteed workers the right to organize unions, engage in collective bargaining, and strike without employer interference, enforced by the National Labor Relations Board. This led to a surge in union membership from 3 million in 1933 to over 8 million by 1940, empowering the labor movement. The Social Security Act of August 1935 marked a milestone by creating a federal pension system for retirees, unemployment insurance, and aid for dependents and the disabled, funded through payroll taxes and initially covering about 60% of workers, though exclusions for agricultural and domestic laborers disproportionately affected minorities until expansions in the 1950s. Labor rights were fortified by the National Labor Relations Act, or Wagner Act, of July 1935, which protected workers' rights to organize unions and bargain collectively, establishing the National Labor Relations Board to mediate disputes and leading to union membership surging from 3 million in 1933 to 15 million by 1945. By 1936, Roosevelt's New Deal policies, combined with his charismatic radio presence and optimistic demeanor, had made him extraordinarily popular among the working-class farmers and minorities, despite opposition from business leaders who labeled him a socialist. In the presidential election that November, he faced Republican Alf Landon, governor of Kansas, who criticized the New Deal as wasteful and unconstitutional. Roosevelt campaigned vigorously, highlighting economic improvements. Unemployment had dropped to 17%, industrial production was rising, and defending his programs as essential for the common man. The result was a historic landslide victory, with Roosevelt capturing 523 electoral votes to Landon's 8, winning all but 2 states and securing nearly 61% of the popular vote, the largest margin since 1820. This triumph reinforced the New Deal coalition, a diverse alliance of labor unions, urban ethnic voters, Southern Democrats, intellectuals, and African Americans, who shifted en masse from the Republican Party of Lincoln to the Democrats due to New Deal relief programs and Eleanor's advocacy for civil rights, setting the stage for Democratic dominance in national politics for generations. During the early years of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's presidency, starting in 1933, the New Deal programs faced substantial criticism from conservative quarters, who viewed them as an unprecedented and dangerous expansion of federal government power and spending. Figures like former President Herbert Hoover, business leaders from organizations such as the American Liberty League, and Republican politicians argued that initiatives like the Works Progress Administration and the Agricultural Adjustment Administration represented a radical departure from traditional American capitalist principles, which emphasized limited government intervention and free market dynamics. Critics labeled the New Deal as a slide toward collectivism or outright socialism, claiming it fostered dependency on the state, stifled individual initiative, and burdened future generations with massive public debt. Federal spending ballooned from about $4.6 billion in 1933 to over $8 billion by 1936. They pointed to programs that regulated industries, set wages, and provided direct relief as infringing on private enterprise, with some, like industrialist Al Smith, warning that it echoed European status models and could erode personal freedoms. This opposition manifested in media campaigns, lawsuits challenging the constitutionality of New Deal laws, and electoral challenges, though public support for Roosevelt's relief efforts largely muted these voices in the 1936 election landslide. Emboldened by his re-election, but frustrated by judicial obstacles, Roosevelt addressed challenges from the Supreme Court during his second term, which began in January 1937, the first inauguration on January 20th due to the 20th Amendment. The conservative-leaning court, with 4 justices consistently opposing New Deal laws, had struck down key programs like the COIO in 1936 and the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1935, arguing they exceeded federal authority. In February 1937, Roosevelt proposed the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill, commonly called the Court Packing Plan, which would allow the president to appoint an additional justice for each sitting justice over age 70, up to 6 new ones, ostensibly to ease the court's workload, but clearly aimed at creating a more liberal majority. In 1937, Roosevelt encountered one of his most significant political setbacks with his attempt to reform the Supreme Court, often derided as the Court Packing Plan, which drew widespread accusations of undermining the constitutional separation of powers. Frustrated by the conservative-leaning court's rulings that invalidated key New Deal measures, such as the National Industrial Recovery Act in 1935 and the Agricultural Adjustment Act in 1936, on grounds of exceeding federal authority, Roosevelt proposed the Judicial Procedures Reform Bill in February 1937. The legislation would have allowed him to appoint up to 6 additional justices for each sitting justice over age 70, potentially expanding the court from 9 to 15 members to create a more favorable majority. The proposal ignited fierce backlash from Democrats, Republicans, the public, and even Vice President John Nance Garner, who viewed it as an assault on judicial independence and separation of powers. After months of heated congressional hearings and public debate, the bill failed in the Senate in July 1937, damaging Roosevelt's prestige temporarily. However, the controversy prompted a shift. Justice Owen Roberts began voting to uphold New Deal laws in what was dubbed the switch in time that saved 9, and retirements allowed Roosevelt to appoint 7 justices by 1941, including liberals like Hugo Black and Felix Frankfurter, ultimately securing a court more amenable to federal economic regulation. Commander-in-Chief, World War II. As global tensions escalated in the late 1930s, Roosevelt gradually shifted his focus from domestic reforms to foreign policy, navigating a nation deeply committed to isolationism after World War I. The Neutrality Acts of 1935 to 1937 prohibited arms sales and loans to belligerents, reflecting widespread sentiment against entanglement in foreign wars, as evidenced by the America First Committee and figures like Charles Lindbergh. However, events like Japan's invasion of China in 1937, Germany's Anschluss with Austria in March 1938, and the horrific Kristallnacht pogroms against Jews in November 1938 began eroding isolationist views, with public opinion polls showing increasing support for aiding democracies. Roosevelt responded by delivering speeches warning of aggressor nations, such as his 1937 quarantine speech, calling for isolating dictatorships. By 1939, he pushed for revisions to the Neutrality Acts to allow cash and carry sales of arms to Britain and France. And after Germany's invasion of Poland in September 1939 sparked World War II, he initiated military buildup, increasing defense spending from $1.1 billion in 1939 to $17.5 billion by 1941, expanding the Army and Navy through the first peacetime draft in 1940, and preparing the U.S. for potential involvement while publicly pledging to keep America out of war. With the outbreak of World War II on September 1st, 1939, triggered by Nazi Germany's invasion of Poland, which prompted Britain and France to declare war on Germany 2 days later, Franklin Delano Roosevelt moved decisively to support the Allied powers while navigating strong isolationist sentiments at home. He advocated for revising the Neutrality Acts, which had restricted U.S. arms sales to belligerents, and in November 1939, Congress amended them to allow cash and carry purchases, permitting Britain and France to buy weapons if they paid up front and transported them on their own ships, thereby aiding them without direct U.S. involvement. Roosevelt also initiated a confidential correspondence with Winston Churchill, who became Britain's Prime Minister in May 1940, exchanging over 1,700 messages throughout the war that built a deep personal and strategic alliance, often bypassing formal diplomatic channels. Following the rapid fall of France to German forces in June 1940, which shocked Americans and diminished isolationism, Roosevelt pushed for increased military preparedness. In September 1940, he signed the Selective Training and Service Act, instituting the first peacetime draft in U.S. history, registering over 16 million men aged 21 to 35, and eventually drafting 10 million into service. That same month, he negotiated the Destroyers for Bases Agreement, transferring 50 aging U.S. Navy destroyers to Britain in exchange for 99 years leases on British military bases in the Western Hemisphere, bolstering Allied defenses against German U-boat attacks in the Atlantic. In his January 6, 1941, State of the Union address, Roosevelt articulated his vision of a post-war world through the Four Freedoms speech, emphasizing freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear as universal rights that the U.S. should promote globally, a message that resonated internationally and was later incorporated into the United Nations Charter. This was followed by the Lend-Lease Act, signed on March 11, 1941, which authorized the President to sell, transfer, exchange, lease, lend military aid to any nation deemed vital to U.S. defense. Over the war, it provided $50 billion in supplies to allies, including Britain, the Soviet Union after Germany's June 1941 invasion, and China, without requiring immediate repayment, positioning the U.S. as the arsenal of democracy, as Roosevelt described in a December 1940 fireside chat. Culminating these efforts in August 1941, Roosevelt and Churchill met secretly aboard ships off Newfoundland for the Atlantic Conference, where they issued the Atlantic Charter on August 14th, a joint declaration outlining 8 principles for the post-war world, such as no territorial aggrandizement, self-determination for peoples, free trade, disarmament, and international cooperation to ensure economic and social security, which influenced the formation of the United Nations and symbolized the strengthening Anglo-American alliance. Amid escalating global crises, Roosevelt broke with the unwritten 2-term tradition established by George Washington, announcing his candidacy for a 3rd term at the Democratic National Convention in July 1940, arguing that experienced leadership was essential during the threat of war and that changing presidents would disrupt national unity. Facing Republican nominee Wendell Willkie, a former Democrat and internationalist businessman who criticized New Deal overreach but shared Roosevelt's views on aiding Britain, the campaign focused on foreign policy, with Roosevelt pledging to keep America out of foreign wars while preparing defenses, famously stating in a Boston speech, "Your boys are not going to be sent into any foreign wars." Despite isolationist opposition from groups like the America First Committee, Roosevelt's incumbency advantage, economic recovery from the New Deal, and public trust in his handling of the European crisis led to a decisive victory on November 5th, 1940, where he garnered 54.7% of the popular vote and carried 38 of 48 states with 449 electoral votes to 82, marking the first time a president was elected to 3 terms and solidifying Democratic control amid wartime uncertainties. Tensions with Japan, fueled by its aggressive expansion in Asia, including the 1937 invasion of China and 1940 occupation of French Indochina, worsened as Roosevelt imposed economic sanctions, culminating in a July 1941 oil embargo that cut off 80% of Japan's oil supply, aiming to curb its militarism, but prompting Japanese leaders to plan a preemptive strike. On December 7, 1941, Japanese forces launched a devastating surprise aerial attack on the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, involving over 350 aircraft from 6 carriers, which sank or damaged 18 ships, including 8 battleships, destroyed nearly 200 planes, and killed 2,403 Americans, while wounding 1,178 others, crippling the Pacific Fleet in under 2 hours. The assault unified the nation overnight, ending isolationist debates. The following day, December 8th, Roosevelt addressed a joint session of Congress in a 6-minute speech broadcast to 81% of American households, declaring December 7th a date which will live in infamy and requesting a declaration of war against Japan, which passed with only 1 dissenting vote from pacifist Jeanette Rankin. On December 11th, Germany and Italy, bound by the tripartite pact with Japan, declared war on the United States, prompting Roosevelt to secure congressional declarations against them the same day, fully committing the U.S. to a two-front global war. In the wake of the Pearl Harbor attack, Roosevelt's issuance of Executive Order 9066 on February 19, 1942, authorized the forced relocation and incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, from the West Coast into inland internment camps, a decision widely regarded as one of the gravest civil liberties violations in American history. Motivated by wartime hysteria, unsubstantiated fears of espionage following Japan's aggression, and pressure from military leaders like General John DeWitt, the order led to the evacuation of entire communities without due process, resulting in the loss of homes, businesses, and personal property worth an estimated $400 million. Detainees endured harsh conditions in 10 remote camps, such as Manzanar in California and Heart Mountain in Wyoming, facing overcrowding, inadequate facilities, and psychological trauma for up to 3 years. The Supreme Court upheld the policy in 1944 Korematsu versus United States case, but it was later repudiated. In 1988, Congress issued a formal apology and reparations under the Civil Liberties Act. Critics, including later historians, and the 1983 Commission on Wartime Relocation, condemned it as racially motivated hysteria rather than military necessity, highlighting the absence of similar measures against German or Italian Americans, and Roosevelt's role in endorsing a policy that contradicted American ideals of justice and equality. As commander-in-chief during World War II, Roosevelt orchestrated the transformation of the U.S. economy into a wartime powerhouse, mobilizing industries through the War Production Board established in January 1942, which oversaw the conversion of factories to produce tanks, planes, and ships, resulting in output like 300,000 aircraft and 100,000 armored vehicles by war's end, while his fireside chats, such as the one on December 9, 1941, reassured the public and boosted morale by explaining strategies in accessible terms. He adopted a Germany first or Europe first strategy, agreed upon with British leaders, prioritizing the defeat of Nazi Germany due to its greater industrial threat, while holding Japan in check in the Pacific, allocating about 85% of resources to the European theater initially. In strategic planning, Roosevelt created the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in February 1942, comprising top military leaders like General George Marshall and Admiral Ernest King, to coordinate American forces, and the combined Chiefs of Staff with Britain for Allied operations. Fearing a German atomic bomb after receiving a 1939 letter from Albert Einstein warning of nuclear potential, he authorized the top-secret Manhattan Project in 1941, directing over $2 billion and 130,000 personnel under General Leslie Groves and physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer to develop the weapon, though he did not live to see its use. Throughout his presidency from 1933 to 1945, Roosevelt's administrative style was frequently criticized for its elements of secrecy, deviousness, and centralized control, which some saw as manipulative and opaque governance. He often assigned overlapping tasks to multiple aides, such as giving conflicting instructions to advisors like Raymond Moley and Rexford Tugwell during New Deal planning to foster competition and ensure diverse input. But this approach bred confusion, inefficiency, and resentment within his administration, with critics like Interior Secretary Harold Ickes documenting in diaries how it led to infighting and wasted efforts. Roosevelt's penchant for making unilateral decisions extended to major policies. For instance, he kept the Manhattan Project's atomic bomb development so classified that even Vice President Harry Truman was uninformed until after Roosevelt's death in April 1945, learning of it only upon assuming the presidency. Similarly, his declining health, marked by hypertension and heart issues, was concealed from the public through staged photographs and limited press access, raising ethical questions about transparency in leadership. Detractors, including journalists and political opponents, accused him of a conniving style that prioritized personal control over collaborative democracy, potentially setting dangerous precedents for executive overreach. As international tensions escalated in the late 1930s, Roosevelt's policies began incorporating elements of civil rights advancement, though tempered by the need to maintain support from Southern Democrats who opposed federal intervention in racial matters. He refrained from endorsing anti-lynching legislation, such as the Costigan-Wagner Bill in 1934 to 1935, to avoid alienating key congressional allies, despite Eleanor's advocacy and public pressure from groups like the NAACP. However, New Deal programs provided an economic foundation for the African American community by including them in relief efforts, with agencies like the WPA employing over 1 million black workers in jobs ranging from construction to arts, and initiatives like the CCC integrating camps in some regions, offering skills, training, and wages that helped alleviate poverty in the Jim Crow South. A significant breakthrough came with Executive Order 8802, issued on June 25, 1941, in response to threatened marches by A. Philip Randolph and the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. It prohibited racial, religious, and ethnic discrimination in defense industries and federal training programs, creating the Fair Employment Practices Committee to investigate complaints and enforce compliance, opening over 1 million jobs to non-white workers during the war, and representing the most substantial federal civil rights action since Reconstruction. As reports of Nazi persecution of Jews emerged in the 1930s and escalated during World War II, Roosevelt's administration has been scrutinized by historians for its inadequate response to the Holocaust, with debates centering on missed opportunities for rescue and underlying attitudes toward Jewish immigration. Despite early awareness, such as the 1938 Evian Conference, where U.S. delegates resisted raising quotas, and public condemnations of events like Kristallnacht in November 1938, critics argue Roosevelt did little to loosen restrictive immigration laws under the 1924 quotas, which limited Jewish refugees to about 26,000 annually from Germany and Austria, filling only partially amid bureaucratic hurdles. Efforts like the 1939 Wagner-Rogers Bill to admit 20,000 Jewish children failed due to isolationist and anti-Semitic sentiments in Congress, which Roosevelt did not forcefully challenge to preserve political capital for defense priorities. The establishment of the War Refugee Board in January 1944, prompted by Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau Jr.'s report on State Department obstructionism, did facilitate the rescue of around 200,000 Jews through neutral countries. But historians like David Wyman in The Abandonment of the Jews contend it came too late, after millions had perished, and that Roosevelt could have bombed Auschwitz rail lines or used executive action earlier. Additionally, private remarks, such as his 1920s comments on limiting Jewish students at Harvard to avoid over-representation, and 1940s suggestions of dispersing Jews in professions, have fueled scrutiny over possible anti-Semitic biases influencing policy and action. Major military campaigns under Roosevelt's oversight included pivotal Pacific victories, like the Battle of Midway from June 4th to 7th, 1942, where U.S. carrier forces sank 4 Japanese carriers, halting Japan's advance and shifting momentum, followed by the grueling Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 to February 1943, the first major Allied offensive in the Pacific that cost 7,100 American lives, but secured a strategic foothold. In the European theater, U.S. and British forces launched Operation Torch in November 1942, invading Vichy French North Africa with over 100,000 troops under General Dwight D. Eisenhower, defeating Axis forces by May 1943, and paving the way for the July 1943 invasion of Sicily and the September 1943 landing on mainland Italy, which led to Italy's surrender in September, but bogged down in protracted fighting. At the Tehran Conference from November 28th to December 1st, 1943, Roosevelt met in person for the first time with Churchill and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin in Iran, where they coordinated grand strategy. Roosevelt, seeking to build trust with Stalin, committed to opening a second front in Western Europe with a cross-channel invasion in spring 1944, while agreeing on post-war spheres of influence and Soviet entry against Japan after Germany's defeat. The D-Day invasion, Operation Overlord, commenced on June 6, 1944, with 156,000 Allied troops storming 5 beaches in Normandy, France under Eisenhower's command, supported by 11,000 aircraft and 7,000 ships, marking the largest amphibious assault in history and a decisive turning point that liberated Paris by August and pushed toward Germany. That evening, Roosevelt addressed the nation in a fireside chat framed as a mass prayer, invoking divine guidance for the troops, which was heard by an estimated 100 million Americans, and reinforced national unity. On the home front, Roosevelt expanded his vision of social reform during the war. In his January 11, 1944, State of the Union address, he proposed an Economic Bill of Rights, or Second Bill of Rights, advocating government guarantees for adequate employment, fair wages, housing, medical care, education, and protection from economic fears, though it was never enacted into law but influenced post-war policies. He also strongly supported the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, known as the GI Bill, signed on June 22, 1944, which provided returning veterans with benefits including tuition-free college education, low-interest home and business loans, and unemployment insurance, benefiting nearly 8 million veterans and fueling post-war prosperity, passing Congress unanimously amid broad bipartisan support. Despite his deteriorating health, evident in his gaunt appearance and reliance on aides, Roosevelt sought a 4th term in 1944, insisting continuity was vital during the war's climax. At the Democratic Convention in July, he replaced the progressive Vice President Henry A. Wallace, viewed as too left-leaning, with Missouri Senator Harry S. Truman, a compromise choice, to appease party conservatives. Facing Republican Thomas E. Dewey, New York governor who attacked New Deal bureaucracy, and Roosevelt's age, the campaign emphasized Roosevelt's wartime leadership. He won on November 7, 1944, with 53.4% of the popular vote and 432 electoral votes to 99, carrying 36 states, though by a narrower margin than previous elections, reflecting some war weariness. In February 1945, Roosevelt traveled to the Yalta Conference in Crimea from February 4th to 11th, meeting again with Churchill and Stalin to shape the post-war order amid advancing Allied armies. Physically weakened, arriving by ship and plane in a grueling journey, Roosevelt focused on securing Soviet commitments. Stalin agreed to enter the war against Japan within 3 months of Germany's defeat, which he honored in August 1945, and to participate in the founding of the United Nations at the San Francisco Conference in April. Discussions also covered the division of Germany into occupation zones, war reparations, and the establishment of democratic governments in liberated Eastern Europe, though critics later accused Roosevelt of naivety or concessions to Stalin, allowing Soviet dominance in Poland and other areas due to the Red Army's presence. But Roosevelt prioritized Allied unity and believed personal diplomacy could moderate Stalin's ambitions. Near the end of his presidency, Roosevelt's diplomacy at the Yalta Conference in February 1945 has drawn criticism for what many perceive as naive trust in Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin, contributing to post-war Soviet domination in Eastern Europe and the onset of the Cold War. Meeting with Stalin and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill in Crimea amid advancing Allied forces, Roosevelt, weakened by illness, prioritized securing Soviet commitments to enter the war against Japan and participate in the United Nations, conceding to Stalin's demands for influence in Poland and other liberated territories in exchange for promises of free elections and democratic governments. Agreements included dividing Germany into occupation zones, extracting reparations from Germany, and recognizing Soviet-backed governments in Eastern Europe with vague assurances of democratic processes. Critics, such as those in the 1950s Republican narrative and historians like Arthur Schlesinger Jr., argue Roosevelt underestimated Stalin's intentions, failing to enforce stricter safeguards due to over-reliance on personal rapport and underestimation of Soviet expansionism, leading to the Iron Curtain's descent and conflicts like the Berlin blockade. Defenders note the Red Army's occupation of the region made concessions inevitable for Allied unity, but the perceived sellout fueled decades of debate over whether firmer U.S. stance could have altered the Cold War's trajectory. The cumulative strain of 12 years in office, compounded by the war's demands, severely impacted Roosevelt's health. By 1944, diagnoses included severe hypertension with blood pressure readings over 200 over 100, advanced atherosclerosis, and congestive heart failure, managed with digitalis and rest, but concealed from the public through limited press access and staged appearances. He continued duties, but on April 12, 1945, while vacationing at his Warm Springs, Georgia, retreat known as the Little White House, where he was sitting for a portrait and reviewing speeches, he complained of a terrific pain in his head and collapsed from a massive cerebral hemorrhage, dying at 3:35 p.m. at age 63. Vice President Truman was sworn in hours later. Roosevelt's death just 82 days into his fourth term and 25 days before Germany's surrender on May 8th stunned the world. Millions mourned as his funeral train traveled from Georgia to Washington, D.C. for a state funeral on April 14th, before burial on April 15th in the Rose Garden of his Springwood estate in Hyde Park, New York, alongside his wife, Eleanor, years later. Behind the curtain of power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Anna Eleanor Roosevelt's marriage began on March 17, 1905, in a high-profile ceremony where President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor's uncle, gave the bride away. From the outset, the union faced challenges, including interference from Franklin's domineering mother, Sarah, who often clashed with Eleanor over household matters, and child-rearing at their homes in Hyde Park and New York City. Eleanor, who was shy and insecure in her early years as a wife, later described sexual intimacy as an ordeal to be endured, reflecting her discomfort and the couple's mismatched emotional needs. Franklin was outgoing and flirtatious, while Eleanor struggled with feelings of inadequacy stemming from her own difficult childhood. They had 6 children between 1906 and 1916: Anna, James, Franklin, Elliot, another Franklin Jr., and John. But family life was strained by Franklin's frequent absences due to his political ambitions and Eleanor's growing sense of isolation. The marriage was irrevocably altered by Franklin's extramarital affair with Lucy Mercer, which began in 1914, when Mercer was hired as Eleanor's social secretary to assist with correspondence and events during Franklin's tenure as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. The relationship developed into a romantic one, with clandestine meetings and affectionate letters, providing Franklin with the emotional warmth he felt lacking at home. It continued discreetly until September 1918, when Eleanor discovered a bundle of love letters from Mercer while unpacking Franklin's luggage after his return from a wartime trip to Europe. Devastated, Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce, but he hesitated due to the scandal's potential impact on his career and family. Sarah Roosevelt intervened forcefully, threatening to disinherit Franklin if he pursued divorce, emphasizing that it would destroy his political future in an era when such matters were taboo for public figures. Franklin agreed to end the affair and promised never to see Mercer again, though the marriage transformed into a pragmatic partnership focused on mutual respect, shared political goals, and convenience rather than romantic love or physical intimacy. Eleanor, empowered by the crisis, began establishing greater independence, moving into her own bedroom and later acquiring a separate cottage at Valkill near Hyde Park in the 1920s, where she pursued personal interests and hosted friends away from Sarah's influence. In the years following the 1918 discovery, Eleanor evolved into a formidable political partner and activist, stepping out from Franklin's shadow, especially after his 1921 polio diagnosis, which confined him to a wheelchair. She became his eyes and ears, traveling extensively across the United States during the 1920s and 1930s to inspect New Deal programs, visit coal mines, factories, and impoverished communities, and report back detailed observations that informed his policies. Starting in 1933, as First Lady, she held weekly press conferences exclusively for female reporters, a groundbreaking move that promoted women in journalism and allowed her to address issues directly. From 1936 onward, she wrote a syndicated newspaper column called My Day, published 6 days a week until 1962, reaching millions with reflections on daily life, social issues, and politics. She often used it to test public reactions to potential policies, serving as trial balloons for Franklin's administration. Eleanor championed causes like civil rights, advocating for anti-lynching laws and integration, women's rights, supporting equal pay and opportunities, and social justice, lobbying Franklin persistently on matters such as refugee aid and labor reforms. While her activism strengthened their professional bond, it sometimes created personal friction, particularly during the World War II, when Franklin sought lighter, less demanding companionship amid the stresses of leadership. Throughout the 1920s and 1930s, allegations of other extramarital relationships surfaced, adding layers to Franklin's personal life. He was rumored to have maintained a close, possibly romantic 20-year affair with Marguerite Missy LeHand, his private secretary who joined his staff in 1920 during his vice presidential campaign. LeHand handled his correspondence, schedules, and even financial affairs, living in the White House from 1933 and becoming an intimate confidant. Their bond was described by contemporaries as deeply affectionate, with LeHand providing emotional support during his health struggles, though the exact nature, whether platonic or romantic, remains debated due to destroyed correspondence after her 1944 death. During the World War II, starting around 1940, Franklin developed a warm friendship with Crown Princess Myrtha of Norway, who fled to the United States after the Nazi invasion of her country. She and her children were hosted at the White House multiple times, and their relationship was characterized by mutual admiration and light-hearted interactions, with some historians suggesting a romantic element based on private letters and Eleanor's reported jealousy, though it was likely more companionship than a full affair. By 1941, Franklin rekindled his relationship with Lucy Mercer, now Lucy Mercer Rutherford, after her 1920 marriage and 1944 widowhood, breaking his earlier promise to Eleanor. Their renewed connection provided Franklin with solace during the intense pressures of wartime presidency, involving secret meetings at the White House and his retreats. This reunion was facilitated by their daughter, Anna Roosevelt Budiger, who had moved into the White House in 1944 to support her father amid his declining health. Anna, the eldest child born in 1906 and a journalist by profession, took on a caregiving role, managing his schedule, ensuring rest, and arranging discreet visits with Mercer to alleviate his loneliness and stress, believing it beneficial for his well-being. When Eleanor discovered Anna's involvement in these arrangements later that year, it caused a profound rift between mother and daughter, exacerbating existing tensions. Eleanor felt betrayed, viewing it as a violation of family loyalty, though they eventually reconciled somewhat before Franklin's death. Lucy was present with Franklin at Warm Springs, Georgia, on April 12, 1945, when he suffered a fatal cerebral hemorrhage, underscoring the enduring significance of their bond in his final days, the immortal legacy. Franklin Delano Roosevelt's greatest legacy to the United States was the permanent reshaping of the federal government's role in the lives of its citizens. Before he took office, the government played a minimal oversight role, but through the Great Depression, Roosevelt transformed it into an active guardian of economic and social welfare. The New Deal was not merely a temporary solution, but established a durable foundation for social safety through pillars like Social Security and strict financial regulations. This legacy created a new social contract where the government held a responsibility to protect its vulnerable populations, laying the groundwork for American liberalism for decades to come, and shaping policies on minimum wage and child labor. On the international stage, Roosevelt's legacy was elevating the United States from a nation with isolationist tendencies to a global superpower and the chief architect of the post-war world order. By mobilizing immense industrial power to become the arsenal of democracy and leading the Allies to victory, he solidified America's leadership position. More importantly, his vision extended beyond military victory to give birth to the United Nations. Reviving the idea of collective security, Roosevelt placed the United States at the center of a new global system committed to maintaining peace and multilateralism, a legacy that shaped American foreign policy throughout the Cold War and continues to this day. Beyond policies and strategies, Roosevelt's personal legacy lies in his symbolic image as a resilient and hopeful leader. His concealment of his paralysis to project strength became a metaphor for his ability to lift a nation from its knees. Through his fireside chats, he forged a direct and intimate connection with the public, reinforcing faith in government during the darkest of times. The image of a president who lifted himself from a wheelchair to lift the nation from despair is his most profound, intangible legacy, redefining the qualities of a great leader and continuing to inspire generations.